You know, when we think about Vikings, we picture the longships, right? The raids, the blood and thunder, the warrior culture. But here's the thing that gets me every single time I dive into this period. The most revolutionary Viking of the late 9th century wasn't a warrior at all. She was a widow, a desperate mother, and she changed everything by noticing something that thousands of people had walked past for generations without seeing. Let me paint you a picture. It's the winter of 874 after Christ, Western Norway. Specifically, a settlement near Trondheim's fjord, which, if you've never been there, imagine a landscape that's beautiful in summer and absolutely merciless in winter. This is a world where winter doesn't just arrive, it times a tax asterisk, and in 874, winter came like a wolf at the door. Now, meet Astrid Thornsdottir. She's 32 years old, which in Viking Age Norway means she's not young anymore. She's recently widowed. Her husband Bjorn, he fell during a raid on Scottish monasteries, one of those expeditions that didn't go according to plan. And now, Astrid is managing a household of 7 children and 12 thralls. Think about that responsibility for a moment. 19 people depending on you. And here's the kicker. Just weeks before winter set in, rival raiders burned their grain stores. Just torched them, because that's what you did in this period. You didn't just compete with your neighbors, you destroyed their ability to survive. So picture Astrid watching her children grow hollow-eyed as the food runs out. The elderly members of the settlement? They're starting to die in their sleep. That's what happens when calories become scarce and your body just gives up. This is the reality of subsistence living in the medieval north. One bad season, one raid, one fire, and suddenly you're staring at starvation. What does Astrid do? She spends her days digging through frozen earth with bloodied fingers, searching for anything edible, any roots, any remnant of last season's harvest that might have been missed. This is desperation made physical. This is a mother who will destroy her own hands if it means her children might eat. Third week of this desperate searching. December freeze is setting in hard. And Astrid notices something that doesn't make sense. Something impossible, actually. There's a patch of wild leeks growing near the rocky shore. And they're not just surviving. They're thick, green, thriving. In December. In Norway. Now, this is where Astrid's mind makes a leap that changes history. She's at the spot where thralls clean the daily fish catch. And the soil there? It's black as night. Warm to the touch despite the freeze. Rich with the remnants of fish guts, scales, bones, all the stuff that accumulates when you're processing seafood every single day for years and years. Most people just saw waste, saw the smell, saw something to avoid. But Astrid saw salvation. That very night. And I love this about her. She doesn't wait, doesn't deliberate. That very night she orders her thralls to gather every fish remain from those cleaning rocks. She starts mixing them into the frozen garden soil behind their longhouse, and you can imagine what her neighbors thought. They called her Astrid Fish Mad. The crazy widow who's lost her mind mixing fish guts into frozen dirt while her children starve. You can hear the mockery, right? The judgment. But here's the thing about desperation. It gives you a kind of clarity that comfortable people never achieve. When your children are dying, you don't care what the neighbors think. She persisted. With the determination of a mother watching her family disappear. That's not poetry, that's just fact. She kept at it through the darkest part of winter. Spring's first thaw arrives. And Astrid's garden explodes. Not figuratively. Not like, oh, it grew nicely. It times explodes, times with growth. Cabbages twice the normal size. Barley growing thick as a man's wrist, and if you know grain, you know that's almost unnatural. Onions so pungent they brought tears. But these were tears of joy rather than hunger, because Astrid had just cracked a code that European agriculture wouldn't fully understand for another 1,000 years. Word spread. And this is where we see the Viking communication network in action, because it was actually pretty impressive. Traders carried tales of Astrid's impossible garden to every fjord and settlement in the region, within 2 seasons. Just 2 seasons. This goes from one desperate woman's discovery to a revolution that will reshape Viking civilization. Think about that speed of adoption. No printing press, no internet, just word of mouth and the undeniable evidence of harvests that shouldn't be possible. Here's where it gets really interesting from a cultural standpoint. The Jarls. These are your local power players, your warrior nobility. They initially mocked the practice. Of course they did. It came from a widow. It involved fish guts. It seemed beneath the dignity of warriors. But then they started seeing their rivals' superior harvests. And in a subsistence economy, the guy who can feed more people wields more power than the guy with the sharper sword. So these Jarls start demanding their thralls adopt the technique. Pride takes a back seat to survival. Always does, eventually. The practice merged with Norse religious understanding in a way that's actually kind of beautiful. The god Njord ruled the sea's bounty. The goddess Freyja blessed the earth's fertility. And Astrid's discovery, it proved their divine union. The sea feeding the earth. It times made sense, times within their worldview. This is how innovations survive. They have to fit into the existing cultural framework or people reject them no matter how effective they are. By 876, just 2 years after that desperate winter, Astrid is travelling between settlements as an honoured teacher. Not as Astrid fish mad anymore. Now she's showing women exactly how to layer fish waste with soil, when to apply it for maximum benefit, how to store it through winter months without losing its potency. She's become, essentially, an agricultural consultant, a specialist. In a warrior culture, think about that transformation. From mocked widow to respected expert in 24 months. And here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this story. How many other Astrids were there? How many desperate innovations happened that times didn't catch on? How many discoveries died with the discoverer because the circumstances weren't quite right, because the communication networks didn't fire, because people were too proud or too stupid to recognize salvation when it was offered. But this one stuck. This one spread. And it's about to transform not just how Vikings eat, but how Vikings conquer. So we left off with Astrid's technique spreading like wildfire through the Viking world. But here's where the story gets really fascinating, because we're about to watch an agricultural innovation completely reshape the power structures of an entire civilization. And it happens fast. Faster than you'd think possible. Between 875 and 920, that's 45 years. Astrid's fertilization technique transforms Viking society from the ground up, literally and figuratively. And I want you to understand the scale of what's happening here, because it's easy to think, oh, better farming, that's nice, and miss the revolutionary implications. Let's start with Iceland. The settlement of Iceland begins in 874, the exact same year Astrid is digging through frozen earth with bloodied fingers. Coincidence? Maybe. But here's what's not coincidence. The fact that Icelandic colonization succeeded largely because settlers specifically chose coastal sites where fish waste could enrich volcanic soil that would otherwise support only sheep. Think about that strategic calculation. They're not just looking for shelter or defensible positions, they're thinking about fertilizer logistics before they even build their first house. Ingolf Arnason. He's Iceland's first permanent settler. Traditional histories tell you about his journey, his courage, how he threw his high-seat pillars overboard and settled where they washed ashore. That's all true. But here's what they often leave out. Ingolf brought 2 of Astrid's trained disciples with his expedition, 2 women, Thora Soil Blessed and Gudrun Garden Keeper, and Ingolf considered their knowledge as valuable as any warrior's sword skill. Actually, probably more valuable, because you can't eat a sword. These women, Thora and Gudrun, they established teaching centers in Iceland, not just passing on the basic technique, but innovating, adapting, because Iceland's environment is harsh in ways that Norway isn't. Volcanic soil has different properties. The growing season is shorter, So they're mixing fish waste with volcanic ash and seaweed to create what we might call, and I'm using modern terminology here, a super fertile growing medium. They're doing experimental agriculture in the 9th century, running trials, comparing results. This is science, even if they wouldn't have called it that. Now, let's talk about the social revolution, because this is where things get really interesting from a power dynamics perspective. Traditional Viking warriors, the guys who've been running the show for generations, they suddenly find themselves dependent on farming families who control the fertilizer supply chains. Imagine being a warrior who's made his reputation raiding monasteries in Ireland, and now you need to negotiate with the woman down the fjord because she controls the best fish processing operation, and without her waste products, your fields won't produce enough to feed your warband. The power dynamics just flipped. Marriage negotiations evolved in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. A woman who understood Astrid's methods could command a bride price equal to 20 cows. 20 cows. That's wealth on a scale that puts her in the same category as the daughters of Jarls. And families started hoarding their fertilizer recipes like treasure, because that's what they were. Secret knowledge that translated directly into survival and prosperity. Children grew up singing the fishbone song. I love this detail because it shows you how deep this went into the culture. It's a memorable tune that taught proper ratios of fish waste to soil, timing of application, taboos against wasting any part of the sea's bounty. This is oral tradition as technical manual. Information encoded in rhythm and rhyme, because that's how you preserve knowledge in a largely non-literate society. And it works. 1,000 years later, we can still trace the influence of these practices. The autumn harvest festivals transformed into elaborate celebrations where communities competed to display the largest vegetables and most abundant grain stores. Picture this scene. You've got Vikings, these supposedly grim warriors, getting genuinely excited about who grew the biggest cabbage. There's something wonderfully human about that. The competitive instinct doesn't go away, it just finds a new outlet. Instead of, my raid was more successful than yours, it becomes, my turnips are larger than yours. Same bragging rights, different arena. Skalds, the professional poets, they composed epic poems about Astrid Earth Mother that placed her alongside legendary heroes in the oral tradition. This is significant because it shows cultural acceptance at the highest level. Skaldic poetry was serious business. It's how Vikings remembered their history, celebrated their heroes, defined their values. And now agricultural innovators are getting the same treatment as warriors who died gloriously, in battle. The culture is fundamentally redefining what it means to be heroic. The techniques spread followed Viking trade routes with remarkable precision, from Trondheim to Orkney by 880, to Dublin by 890, reaching Kiev by 900 through Swedish Viking merchants who recognized its economic potential. And here's what's beautiful about this. Each region adapted the method to local conditions. This wasn't blind copying. This was intelligent adaptation. Irish Vikings mixed fish waste with peat, which makes perfect sense because peat is what Ireland has in abundance. Orkney settlers combined it with seaweed, taking advantage of what washed up on their shores. Swedish Vikings in Russia discovered that river fish produced equally effective results. They're problem-solving. They're experimenting. They're turning a Norwegian innovation into a universal technique that works across dramatically different environments. Now, here's where it gets militarily significant. The Battle of Hafrsfjord in 885. This is the battle where Harald Fairhair consolidates control over Norway. Traditional military histories attribute his victory to tactics, leadership, or superior forces. All probably true. But there's another factor that doesn't get enough attention, his warriors' superior physical condition. They had been eating vegetables and grains from fertilized fields for 3 seasons, while their enemies subsisted on traditional sparse rations. Think about what that means in practical terms. Better nutrition means stronger soldiers. Means they can march farther, fight longer, recover faster from wounds. Means fewer deaths from disease because their immune systems aren't compromised by malnutrition. This is the hidden advantage that compounds over time. Harald's victory at Hafrsfjord wasn't just about military genius. It was about logistics, about food, about the fact that his people had been implementing Astrid's technique while his enemies were still farming the old way. This military advantage accelerated the technique's adoption across Scandinavia. Because nothing motivates change like watching your enemy become stronger. Jarls who had been holdouts, who thought fish fertilization was beneath their dignity or just superstitious nonsense, they looked at Hafrsfjord and thought, we need that advantage. Suddenly, agricultural innovation became a military necessity. By 900, we're looking at a completely transformed Viking world. The society that emerges from this period isn't the same society that went into it. The power structures have shifted. The economic relationships have changed. The culture has absorbed new heroes, new values, new ways of thinking about human achievement. And it all traces back to one woman noticing green leeks growing in black soil on a December morning in 874. But we're just getting started, because this agricultural revolution is about to enable something that would have been impossible before. It's about to fuel an expansion across the known world that will carry Viking influence from North America to the Middle East. And the engine driving all of it? Fish guts and desperation turned into science. By 950, about 75 years after Astrid's desperate winter discovery, what began as one woman's survival technique had become the hidden engine driving Viking expansion across the known world. And I want to emphasize that word. Hidden. Because when you read about Viking expansion in most history books, they talk about ships and navigation and warrior culture. All true, all important. But they're missing the foundation. You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach. Let's talk about Greenland. Because Greenland is where this story gets almost absurd in terms of environmental challenges. Eric the Red establishes settlements in Greenland in 985. Now, if you know anything about Greenland's climate, you're probably thinking, why would anyone do that? And the answer is, because they could. Because they had the agricultural technology to make it work. The Greenland settlements survived their brutal environment specifically because colonists implemented advanced fish fertilization infrastructure from day one, not as an afterthought, not as a backup plan. From day one, each settlement included designated fertilizer preparation areas, storage buildings for winter preservation of fish waste, carefully planned gardens positioned to maximize the technique's effectiveness in the short growing season. This is sophisticated planning. This is people who understand that in an environment this hostile, you don't improvise, you engineer. Eric's wife, Theodhild. She's trained by one of Astrid's granddaughters, which means we're now 3 generations deep into this knowledge tradition. And Theodhild makes a discovery that's brilliant in its simplicity. She modified the technique for Arctic conditions, discovering that whale blubber, mixed with fish waste, created a slow-release fertilizer that nourished plants through Greenland's brief summer. Whale blubber. She's thinking about nutrient release rates. She's thinking about how to match fertilizer degradation to plant growth cycles in an environment where you've got maybe 3 months of viable growing season. This is agronomy at a level that wouldn't be formally studied in Europe for another 500 years. Now, let's zoom back and look at the economic revolution that's happening simultaneously across the Viking world. Because while Greenland is the dramatic example, the real money is being made closer to home. Viking merchants in York and Dublin are dominating agricultural markets. But here's the thing. They're not doing it through military force. They're doing it through superior produce that commanded premium prices. Think about that shift. A single ship carrying fertilized grown vegetables from Norway to London could generate profits equal to a successful raiding expedition. Equal to, without the risk of death, without the diplomatic consequences of showing up and burning monasteries. This is a fundamental shift in the Viking economic model from extraction through violence to wealth creation through trade. And at the center of this economic revolution, women. Astrid's great-granddaughter, Freydis the Wealthy, controlled a fertilizer empire spanning from Trondheim to Reykjavik. She commanded respect equal to any war chief. Let that sink in. In a warrior culture famous for its masculine violence, a woman controlling an agricultural supply chain has the same social status as a man who leads raids. That's not a small shift. That's a complete reimagining of how power works. Freydis established the first fertilizer guilds. These were organizations of women who guarded their agricultural secrets while training selected apprentices in advanced techniques. We're talking about seasonal rotation strategies, optimal fish species selection for different crops. They knew that herring waste worked better for certain grains, while cod remains were superior for root vegetables. This is specialized knowledge being systematically preserved and transmitted. It's professionalizing. It's becoming an institution that will outlast any individual practitioner. And then we come to Vinland, North America. Around 1000 after Christ. Leif Erikson's expeditions carried the technique across the Atlantic. And what happens in Vinland is something I find genuinely moving from a historical perspective. It's one of those rare moments of cultural exchange that could have changed everything if circumstances had been different. Native peoples observed Vikings feeding the earth with the sea and shared their own agricultural wisdom in return. The Three Sisters planting method. Corn, beans, and squash grown together in a symbiotic relationship that maximizes yield and soil health. This is sophisticated agriculture meeting. Sophisticated agriculture. Neither side is primitive. Neither side is superior. They're just different solutions to the same problem, and for a brief moment, they're learning from each other. This cultural pollination created hybrid techniques that combined Viking fish fertilization with Native American companion planting. Imagine what could have developed if the Vinland settlements had succeeded. If this knowledge exchange had continued for generations instead of ending after a few decades, we might be telling a completely different story about North American agriculture. But the settlements failed. The hybrid techniques were lost, and Europe wouldn't encounter Three Sisters planting again until permanent colonization 500 years later. Back in Scandinavia, though, the technique had evolved into what we'd recognize as sophisticated science, even if they wouldn't have called it that. Even if they would have attributed their understanding to divine inspiration or ancestral wisdom, the knowledge was real. Practitioners understood that different fish species produced different results. They knew herring was nitrogen-rich. Cod provided different nutrients. Whale, remains, when you could get them, were like agricultural gold. They understood fermentation time affected nutrient release. Too fresh, and the fish waste could actually burn plants. Too old, and you'd lost potency. There was a sweet spot, and they knew how to hit it. They combined fish waste with other organic materials and discovered synergistic effects that multiplied fertility beyond simple addition. Fish waste plus seaweed wasn't just additive. It was multiplicative. The combination unlocked nutrients in ways that neither material could achieve alone. They were discovering principles of nutrient cycling and soil chemistry through direct observation and experimentation. No microscopes, no chemical analysis, just careful attention and a willingness to try new combinations. By 1000 after Christ, we're looking at an agricultural system that supports population densities in Scandinavia that wouldn't have been possible 2 centuries earlier. And that population growth is funding everything else: the longships, the trade networks, the settlements in Iceland and Greenland, the expeditions to Vinland, the integration into European political systems through the Danelaw and Normandy. All of it rests on the foundation of surplus food production that lets you do things beyond bare survival. But here's the thing that keeps nagging at me as I think about this story. By 1000 after Christ, Astrid's name is already fading from memory. She's been dead for probably 80 years at this point. Her grandchildren are old, her great-grandchildren are middle-aged, and the technique she discovered is so thoroughly integrated into Viking agriculture that people are starting to forget it ever had to be discovered. It's just how farming works. It's just what you do. And that's when the technique really starts to spread beyond the Viking world, because the cultural packaging that made it specifically Viking is falling away. It's becoming universal. It's becoming something that any culture can adopt without feeling like they're copying the Northmen. The stage is set for this Norse innovation to transform all of Europe, and nobody's going to remember where it came from. So we've followed this story from one desperate widow in 874 through the transformation of Viking society and the expansion across the known world. Now we're going to watch as Astrid's innovation becomes so successful that it erases its own origin story, and there's something almost tragic about that, but also something inevitable. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror, the Battle of Hastings. You know this story, but here's what usually gets left out. William's army was descended from Vikings who had settled in Normandy, and they carried Astrid's agricultural revolution into the heart of medieval Europe, though her name was already fading from memory by this point, replaced by vague references to northern wisdom or Danish methods. William's administrators included agricultural specialists. These weren't just warriors and nobility. These were people who understood farming, and they implemented fish fertilization across English estates, systematically, deliberately. This wasn't cultural diffusion happening accidentally. This was planned technological transfer, and it worked. The population growth that followed the Norman conquest, the growth that would eventually support the construction of great cathedrals and the rise of medieval cities. It wasn't just political stability. It was food. It was surplus calories that freed people to do things other than subsistence farming. Now here's where things get really interesting. From a historical documentation perspective, monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation. Christian monks meticulously recording fertilizer recipes in illuminated manuscripts, beautiful works of art that included, alongside prayers and biblical commentary, detailed instructions for mixing fish waste with soil. But, and this is the kicker, they attributed the knowledge to divine inspiration rather than pagan innovation. You can understand why, right? These are Christian institutions. They're not going to say, we learned this from pagan Vikings who learned it from a woman named Astrid who worshipped Njord and Freya. They're going to say, God revealed this wisdom to us. And, honestly? To them, that's probably true. They didn't know about Astrid. By 1100 after Christ, she's been dead for 200 years. The chain of transmission has been broken enough times that the knowledge seems to have no origin. It's just there, like it always had been. The Cistercian order, particularly, excelled at refining the technique. Their records show yields triple those of unfertilized fields by 1100 after Christ. Triple! That's not incremental improvement. That's revolutionary productivity gain. And the Cistercians were scientific about it in ways that would have made Astrid proud. They kept careful records. They compared results across different monasteries. They experimented with timing and ratios. They were doing peer review before peer review was formalized as a concept. The transformation was so complete that by 1200 after Christ, that's 325 years after Astrid's discovery, European agriculture had thoroughly absorbed Viking fertilization methods without remembering their origin. Think about that for a second. A technique so successful it becomes invisible. It's just how farming works across the entire continent. The three-field rotation system, which historians often present as a medieval European innovation, incorporated fish waste application as standard practice. Coastal communities from Portugal to Poland developed local variations, each believing they had discovered the technique independently. And you know what? In a way, they did. They observed. They experimented. They refined. The fact that someone in Norway had figured it out 3 centuries earlier doesn't diminish their achievement. It just means the same logical process led to the same logical conclusion in different places. The Hanseatic League's dominance in Baltic trade, this is 12 and 1300s now, stemmed partly from agricultural surpluses in former Viking territories, where 8 generations of fertilizer application had created soil so rich it seemed magical to outside observers. Merchants from inland regions would visit coastal areas and couldn't understand why the harvests were so abundant. The soil itself had been transformed. 8 generations of fish waste, systematically applied, had changed the fundamental chemistry of the earth. That's not magic. but it must have seemed like it. Let me give you some numbers to think about. Population estimates suggest Northern Europe supported 30% more people by 1200 after Christ than would have been possible without Astrid's discovery. 30%. We're talking about millions of lives. Millions of people who existed because one woman noticed green leeks growing in fish-enriched soil during a desperate winter. Those millions of people built the cities, staffed the armies, sailed the ships, created the art, wrote the books, had the children who would have the children who would eventually create the Renaissance and the age of exploration and everything that followed. I'm not saying Astrid caused the Renaissance, but I am saying that the chain of causation runs through her discovery. No surplus food, no population growth, no population growth, no urbanization, no cultural flowering. History doesn't have simple causes, but it does have necessary preconditions. Today, archaeologists excavating Viking Age settlements find evidence of sophisticated agricultural infrastructure that had been previously overlooked. Because honestly, archaeologists were looking for weapons, for treasures, for the dramatic stuff. But now they're finding specialized pits for fermenting fish waste, underground storage systems for winter preservation, garden layouts optimized for fertilizer distribution. This is engineering. This is planning. This is people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Soil samples from these sites still show elevated nutrient levels. 12 centuries later, the Earth remembers what Astrid taught it. The nitrogen and phosphorus she helped concentrate in those soils is still there, still enriching harvests for modern farmers who have no idea why their fields are so productive. Modern organic farming movements unknowingly echo her holistic understanding. That waste becomes wealth. That observing nature provides the best solutions. That one person's desperate innovation can feed civilizations for 1,000 years. We think we're discovering these principles. We think we're being innovative. But really? We're rediscovering what Astrid knew in 874. Every backyard gardener who composts fish scraps is following in her footsteps. Every farmer who understands the sea can nourish the land is applying her insight. Every human who recognizes that ancient peoples possessed wisdom we're still rediscovering is honoring her legacy, whether they know her name or not. And here's the final thing I want you to think about as we close this story. Astrid Thornsdottir spent one winter digging through frozen earth with bloodied fingers, trying to save her children. She noticed something. She acted on it. She shared it. And 300 years later, millions of people across an entire continent were alive because of what she discovered. She never knew that. She died probably thinking she'd done a good thing for her community, maybe even for her region. But she couldn't have imagined the scale of her impact. How many other discoveries are waiting to be made by desperate people paying attention? How many innovations are sitting right in front of us, invisible, until someone with nothing left to lose decides to try something everyone else thinks is crazy? How many future Astrids are out there right now, making observations that will change everything? We don't know. We can't know. But we can remember that the woman who taught the earth to feast started with frozen soil, fish guts, and the determination of a mother who refused to watch her children starve. And that changed the world forever.